Republican. Joining us now for reaction from Wisconsin, Republican Congressman Sean Duffy. He sits on the, I think on the Finance Committee, right? And here in Washington, Robert Weissman, president of the advocacy group Public Citizens. Congressman, let's start with you. It's a watchdog. It's returned all this money, billions and billions, what, $14 billion to the consumers. So, why all the chaos over there, and why do Republicans think it's just, it's just up to no good?
So first off, we're shining a light on the CFPB, but those of us on the Financial Services Committee, we've been dealing with this for the last 7 years. Mick Mulvaney used to be on that committee with us. And Laura, you have an agency that can draw $600 million from the Federal Reserve. They don't get money from Congress. And you have one very powerful director. And as you mentioned in your intro, you have an agency of thousands of little Elizabeth Warrens that are just as radical and just as progressive as she is. And they're wreaking havoc on the free enterprise system all across America. And this is an agency that has to get under control. And all Americans believe in consumer protection. But when you have an agency that's promoting a progressive agenda and not protecting consumers, that's where we all have issue.
Robert, that's a big difference. 593 donations to Democrats, 1 to a Republican. I mean, I don't care what party you're from. Like, how can you, with a straight face, say that's a nonpartisan, independent agency that's just a watchdog?
Well, I think you have to look at what the agency's been doing. And what it's been doing is what it's supposed to do. It's been protecting consumers. It's issued more than $12 billion in fines and charges that have been paid back to consumers. Almost 30 million Americans have directly benefited from exposure of rip-offs and cheating by big banks and other financial institutions. It's deterred billions more in rip-offs. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The banks have tons of their own regulatory agencies. They got Goldman Sachs running the Treasury Department, Goldman Sachs running the SEC. They got Goldman Sachs, One West, as the comptroller of the currency. This is the one agency that's supposed to work for consumers, and it's been doing the job.
So there's a guy who used to be head of enforcement, one of the enforcement attorneys, Ron Rubin, who talked to us today, and he said he was actually in meetings where he would hear some of the top people at the CFPB talking about appointees they might bring in, new hires. One guy's like, well, he's a good liberal. Then he's like, oh, I was just kidding. There's a gatekeeper there about the type of people you're going to hire and the type of people you're going to bring in. And they might not have it written down, but it sure seems like a political litmus test that's unspoken for you to get through the door at the CFPB now. Maybe not in the early days, but certainly now.
Well, I think you have an agency that's been doing its job with, unfortunately...
So only with Democrats, like for mostly Democrats. They're doing their job with mostly Democrats.
I have no idea.
Democrats the only gatekeepers for the people?
No, I have no idea about the... You
don't know? That's 500.
But what I do know,
if you're protecting them, you should know.
What I do know is Mick Mulvaney says he wants to destroy the agency. He thinks the agency is a sick joke, and he's going to turn it over
Congressman,
effectively
is it a sick
to
joke?
Wall Street.
Is it a sick joke, this agency? Can you defund it in Congress? Trump can't shut it down. He can't drain the swamp totally, right, here?
So, Laura, the next director can actually request not $600 million, they could request $10 million. So they can actually force Democrats to the table to reform this agency. But we had a bill that would have absolutely restructured the way the CFPB works. And the largest banks in America were opposed to that bill. And the small community banks and credit unions that serve the community where I live, they're the ones who supported this reform to the CFPB. What they've done is they've increased the cost of credit, whether you get a mortgage or an auto loan. They've caused small community banks and credit unions to go out of business or consolidate. That hurts the most rural parts of America. And here they say, we want to be isolated from the Congress and the American people. Well, if you're doing the good work of the American people, Laura, you shouldn't have to be isolated. The American people will applaud you. But if you have a progressive liberal agenda, you have to then be protected from the American people, because they're going to shut you down. And that's why Elizabeth Warren had to separate them from Congress and Congress's ability to fund them, because they knew it had a radical agenda.
So, Robert, do you think there should be any reforms to this at all?
Any reforms to the agency? I think you know what you should do, Laura? I think you and the viewers should go look at the website of the CFPB, and you'll see an agency.
We'll run to that tonight, I'm sure. But go ahead.
It's a website that doesn't look like other governmental agencies.
No.
It's actually clear.
The Federal Reserve pays for this, right? If they kind of insulate themselves because the Federal Reserve profits pay for it, correct?
They're funding it directly from the Fed.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But they're doing their job, and they explain what they're doing. They're incredibly transparent about what's going on. And I think if people go there and see the plain English explanation of what's going on, they're going to like it.
Small community banks, what the congressman said, he's been studying this.
The small community banks,
they don't have any problem with this. They're not being hurt. The credit's not being squeezed on their side.
No, actually, big banks are at record profits and small banks are doing pretty well. The CFPB doesn't have primary jurisdiction over banks for less than $10 billion in jurisdiction.
Very quick, Sean.
Listen, it's the small banks' biggest complaint is the CFPB. The rules and regulations pass to them, and big banks can deal with a lot of rules and regulations. Small banks cannot, and that's why they have to consolidate or go out of business, and that's why it hurt rural America, and that's why rural America came out in force to support Donald Trump.
All right, well, we made some progress understanding a really complex